wonder if this game has a Belt and Road initiative. Many Western powers see the globe as a divide and conquer game. It's no wonder that many from the West cannot fathom that China is not playing this game of conquering, colonizing, or control.
Any country dealing with any other country always has some kind of political
Let me put it this way. I think in terms of this notion that China is somehow trying to take over the world and become a global power, I think is really far-fetched.
I've been very concerned lately about China. I also am just concerned that we've sort of created the economic power that China sort of has now, and they're using it, I fear, going to be using it against us eventually and against the better interests of a lot of people.
Allow me to put your mind to rest.
Okay, great.
You shouldn't worry about it.
Okay.
It's very simple.
You know, they're in Africa. They're lending money to countries to build ports and different infrastructure.
To build what?
Port,
And
harbors.
what's wrong with that?
And, well, because...
Countries that need ports get ports.
But they're making people dependent on... I mean, I know, it's the same thing that we've done, which is
no, it's
horrible
not.
Around the world.
They are far more humanistic than the United States ever was.
We all know the horrible oppression and suffering colonization and imperialism has caused throughout the world, as the West is directly responsible for the economic stagnation, political suppression, and billions upon billions of deaths around the world due to their conquests. In the modern age, China has not only demonstrated that this divide and conquer model is oppressive, but out of date and inefficient. Now, a lot of people, mainly in the West, both liberals and leftists, have accused China's foreign policy as imperialistic. But in reality, this is far beyond the case.
Creating a community with a shared future for humanity. The vision was first proposed in 2012, and in 2017, President Xi Jinping raised the idea again in a speech to the World Economic Forum in Davos. According to the white paper, China values mutual respect and equal consultation on political issues, seeks dialogue instead of confrontation on security matters, and promotes open and win-win cooperation in economic development. China respects the diversity of world civilizations, advocates an environmentally friendly developmental model, and advocates joint efforts to fight climate change.
Peaceful development, mutual benefit, non-intervention, and a win-win diplomacy? Are these the words we use when it comes to imperialist or colonial powers? All I hear as an American is unilateralism, big stick diplomacy, and freedom means invading your country for our oil. In their non-interventionist policy, China builds partnerships rather than alliances for their economic development. This brings some obvious contradictions, but does not hinder China's long-term foreign policy goal. In his 2018 article titled "The Long Game and Its Contradictions," He Zhao stated, "The long-term goal of China's foreign policy is nothing short but the elimination of the primary contradiction of imperialist capitalism, intercontinental inequality. Contradictions in the foreign policies of the CPC include those which result from the strict non-interference in affairs of foreign states, which has characterized China's foreign relations for thousands of years, and the prioritizing of larger international trade relationships over ideological conflict. The live and let live ethic of the modus operandi even applies to ideological enemies. China also trades with the biggest terrorist organization in the world, the USA, without even criticizing its long lists of evil wars and heinous crimes against humanity. Another is not supporting local leftist struggles in partner nations, such as the guerrilla Maoist insurrections in Southeast Asia, if it might jeopardize trade relations with state entities. If the temporary ethical net losses of these contradictions lead to larger net gains, and the positive results in the long term, they are calculated as worthwhile or unavoidable. Although some of their deals are distasteful, China has always emphasized their partnerships are not endorsements, and unlike the West that demands economic, political, and cultural reforms that attach to these trade deals, China seeks mutually agreeable benefits with trading partners that are worthwhile in increasing the wealth for both countries, while acknowledging the unavoidable conflicts that may arise. Victor Lau published a visual guide to Xi Jinping's basic policy on socialism with Chinese characteristics, which included a nifty illustration of China's foreign policy do's and don'ts, which includes the do's: seeking mutually beneficial strategies of opening up, pursue open, innovative, and inclusive development, boost cross-cultural enhancement featuring harmony and diversity and mutual learning, and respect all countries' right to choose their own development paths. The don'ts of China's foreign policy can be summed up as not posing threats to any countries, never seeking expansion, impose one's will on others or interfere in their internal affairs, bullying the weak, develop itself at the expense of others, and surrender its legitimate interest. We can clearly see China seeks world peace by becoming its vanguard while contributing to global development and championing international order. This is a clear threat to Western global hegemony. But rather focusing on this, a more sinister accusation has been alleged against China. Despite this clearly peaceful language of cooperation, respect, and mutual benefits, China has been unfairly accused of imperialism. Paul Morin did an excellent video on how China is clearly not imperialistic, especially as he uses Lenin's own texts and definitions of imperialism. But many still assert that China is still state capitalist, which I thoroughly debunk in my video on socialism with Chinese characteristics here, since they are still applying Marxist-Leninist ideology and constructs in their society and leading the working people through the dictatorship of the proletariat and vanguard party. I would really like to see any other clearly capitalist country that have a communist party that uses the dictatorship of the proletariat for the benefit of Elon Musk, Koch brothers, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, etc. But another assertion is that the CPC and the state is a capitalist oligarchy, as they have billionaires in their parties and represent the financial institutions when imperializing developed countries, especially in Africa. As a Latino, I take grave offense to this because we have experienced what imperialism has done to our communities and countries. And along with Paul's analysis on imperialism, I simply have to ask this. What Chinese companies mandated their governments to assassinate their presidents or candidates? What country did the PLA invade to extract natural resources? What Chinese company toppled democratically elected governments that were not aligned with their interests? Which elections did the CPC manipulate to put their people in power? How many death squads or paramilitary armies did Alibaba sponsor? Does Huawei control the CPC the way that Facebook or Verizon controls Congress? The interest of the CPC is clearly in the hands of the workers and the proletariat as they continue to curb, monitor, and discipline the capitalist class while nationalizing and running many large enterprises in the people's favor that is not dictated by capital or profits. Imperialism is monopoly capitalism, and this does not equate to state capitalism monopolies, because Lenin literally states the following: for socialism is merely the next step forward from state capitalist monopoly. Or in other words, socialism is merely state capitalist monopoly which is made to serve the interests of the whole people and has to that extent ceased to be capitalist monopoly. China is very clearly still serving the best interests of the people as a whole. I talked to Paul about this and he puts it in this way. In China, capitalists do not play an economic decisive role in people's lives. The CPC does. This is clearly evident in their recent crackdown during COVID. The CPC snaps their fingers and all commerce comes to a halt. Compare that with the United States or any other Western capitalist country, which has to beg and plead with private monopolists to temporarily reduce their economic activity. The USA is literally run by a capitalist. The USA is a capitalist monopoly where the state is at the boot heel of capitalists, whereas China is not. And the party's commitment to the people and workers is constantly repeated through culture and action. Now, with all this said, many still beat the drums of imperialism when it comes to China's dealings with the most vulnerable countries in the world, specifically in Africa. But their foreign policy is the epitome of anti-colonial behavior, especially when it comes to their history. We cannot see this better exemplified than looking at Africa itself. Africa was, and in some ways still, under the boot heel of the West due to its colonial and neo-colonial history of brutal suppression, treacherous economics, and race supremacy. The West has attempted to make Africa a victim, dependent, and subordinate to its wealth, both in a paternal and patronizing perspective. From the brutal colonial oppression,
colonization was motivated by the European hunger for African resources. The subsequent exploitation of the African people and the uprooting of their spiritual values by Christian missionaries would leave a permanent European stamp on the continent.
To the embarrassing and demoralizing charity concert NGOs and celebrities raising money for the poor Africans. The cultural concept of giving to Africa, starving children, and struggling development of an entire continent that is so rich in resources comes from Western colonialism and liberalism within a cycle of exploitation and guilt. China has a completely different approach. Titled the 5 Pillars of Sino-Africa Cooperation, China has emphasized 1. Equality and mutual trust in politics. 2. Win-win cooperation in the economy. 3. Mutually enriching cultural exchanges. 4. Mutual assistance in security and solidarity. And 5. Coordination in international affairs. These are mirrored in China's overall foreign policy plans for the world. Now, let's compare this with the foreign aid model of the West and what that has done for Africa. Dambizi Moyo is a liberal Zambian economist that correctly calls out not only the damage aid has done to Africa, but how China is leading the way in economic growth, which challenges the Western model of not only foreign aid, but their democracy as a whole. Now, it is important to note that Moyo is not a Marxist or socialist. It should be known that she is a liberal that advocates for capitalist-controlled markets and has a passion for Western democracies. Despite, ironically, its numbers of failures she herself has listed in many of her books. We must realize that despite her background, education, and knowledge of Africa, she may not be advocating for what we are advocating for, especially when it comes to the continent. However, her knowledge about Africa's plights with foreign aid, particularly with statistical data and how Africa has suffered, her information is tremendously valuable. And it is a breath of fresh air when a non-Western African economist states the following: foreign aid hurts Africa, and China is key to developing the continent. Aid was historically given as a form of colonialism. In her book, Moyo pointed out that the origins of large-scale aid transfers from the West to Africa went as far back as 1896 from the USA, and the 1929 British Colonial Act administered governmental grants, not investments, for infrastructure projects to assert political control over their colonial domain. They wanted Africa to be subservient and dependent of the West. Over the past 60 years, the West has donated over $2 trillion in aid to Africa, not only without any demonstrative increase in their standard of living, but also hindering them. Because between 1970 to 1998, Africa's poverty rate actually rose from 11% to 66%. This was actually the preferred model of neocolonialism as well, since aid first goes to the elites of the country to, assumingly, be dispersed to the poor. I wonder which African leader was the first to even notice this when attempting to liberate their country.
Suffisamment. De quoi mourir? Nous pouvons dépasser même notre production, malheureusement. Par manque d'organisation, nous sommes encore obligés de tendre la main pour demander des aides alimentaires. Ces aides alimentaires qui nous bloquent.
Thomas Sankara was the first African leader to forbid any acceptance of foreign aid or help from the IMF or World Bank, as well as Western countries. And Burkina Faso was able to advance so many infrastructure projects, agriculture, transportation, and deforestation. He made Burkina Faso self-sufficient in less than 4 years because of his actions. I'm surprised that Moyo did not point towards Thomas Sankara's success as an African leader who refused foreign aid and was successful. But she is, in fact, a liberal capitalist. So, there you go. Also, isn't it something that Sankara asked for the World Bank to forgive its loans and debts? And China has done this so many times that some economists think that they have lender's remorse. Billions upon billions have been forgiven from China. As most recently, Xi Jinping announced that all interest-free loans are forgiven in African countries. China will also help build hospitals and send more medical experts to Africa to aid in the coronavirus fight, as well as stated that Africa will be the first in line for its COVID vaccine. It's no wonder that Moyo notes in her book that in the past 60 years, no country has made as a big impact on the political, economical, and social fabric of Africa as China has. It has created transcontinental railways, highways, ports, hospitals, schools, and important public infrastructure through investments, no string attached loans, and much anticipated debt relief. Where some see this as entrapment or imperialism, people of Africa see this as finally meeting an equal and wanting to continue such friendship for the betterment of their people.
The only thing that I would like to say to Chinese people is welcome them. There is the opportunity in Tanzania. There is still that room of us working together.
They built us, they provided us with this infrastructure. So you cannot, because you are good. God bless you.
No more enriching elites through foreign aid, no more dependency on the West, and no more humiliation. Moyo notes in her book that China has breathed life in Africa, especially when it came to infrastructure projects. Through their foreign direct investment, something that Deng Xiaoping welcomed in his opening up and reform policy, China has pledged more development, infrastructure, scholarships, friendly loans, and debt relief that respects Africa's sovereignty, independence, and self-determination more than any other Western NGO or nation in history. No invasions, no death squads, no assassinations, murders of activists, rigged elections, colonialism, neocolonialism, bombs, soldiers, or guns. Only investments and strategic foreign policy looking for mutual beneficial development. Since 2005, China has invested $2 trillion in Africa, with another $60 billion pledged in 2018 at the China-African Cooperation Forum. As the West's $2 trillion did absolutely nothing, let's see what China's $2 trillion of investment did.
Simply a once-in-a-lifetime historic moment for Ethiopians. The first ETRSS-1 remote sensing satellite is now in orbit. It is from here, China's Taiwan Satellite Launching Center, that Ethiopia has managed to send one of its own to orbit.
Now, when did America help out an imperialized country like this? like Guatemala, Honduras, or Bolivia. Have they launched satellites like this to help these countries? We'll get back to that. For now, let's check out a quick video titled CGTN Observes, Is China Luring Africa into a Debt Trap?
For many years, China and Africa shared remarkable similarities, including colonialism and the burden of poverty.
Very important to note, and why trust between these countries really do run deep. Both are victims of imperialism and colonialism, which is why China has shaped their foreign policy, especially with Africa, as one of cooperation and respect. And many Africans support their economic involvement. There are several polls that show China as an emerging positive influencer in Africa, and Ethiopia is becoming the largest example of how Chinese investment can revolutionize economic development in the region.
Ethiopia demonstrates the best model country when it comes how Sino-Africa partnership really delivers results on the ground. We have a comprehensive development partnership with People's Republic of China, and for the last 10 years we have jointly invested on various infrastructure, on railways, which is going to transform the economic potential of the country, on highways, express roads.
Moving on.
Now, in 2009, China overtook the United States as Africa's biggest trading partner, and Chinese foreign direct investment also grew by leaps and bounds. This period also marked the start of unprecedented Chinese infrastructural development across the African continent. From Cape to Cairo, ports, rails and roads and airports have sprung up across Africa, like the 795-kilometer Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway and the Kenya's 500-kilometer standard gauge railway, PSGR, which was completed over a year ahead of schedule. Well, a paradigm shift started to re-engineer Africa and turn around its fortunes. This is because China adopted a different engagement model with Africa from that which the West had pursued since 1885.
I mean, enough said, right? Ethiopia has become the first fastest growing economy in Africa. Ethiopia in particular has become the poster child for Sino-African relations. Once a war-torn nation, is now the top African country. Ethiopia has averaged a GDP growth rate at 11.2% between 2004 and 2018. And it's incredibly impressive as more African countries are accepting aid from China after demonstrating their trust and reliability towards actual development.
The now overhyped debt debate that appears to target and label China as predatory is, to say the least, unfair. Africa's debt burden is not new. For many years, it has had more to do with the West than the East. Countries must borrow to grow, and this is something that happens globally, not just in Africa. Chinese money in Africa has been sunk into real projects, not elusive, intangible ideas that have no impact on the well-being of the people.
That probably says it all about the failure of Western foreign aid to Africa. White people dictating how money ought to be used and developed for a nation they have no idea about, versus treating these countries as equal trading partners for infrastructure and development. This is not entrapment. This is international trade and development. And this is happening to progress places like Ethiopia and beyond, like Angola, Kenya, and other nations that are more than happy to join as partners. Side point, but I want to also point out that if it wasn't for China, ACON would have never helped 400 million Africans to have access to electricity through solar energy. I don't know if anybody has heard this before, but Chinese electric companies, which are state-run enterprises, extended $1 billion credit line for ACON to develop this project, which is not a charity or NGO, but a public-private partnership, creating tens of thousands of jobs and became the largest solar provider on the continent. Beyond this, let these African leaders and people speak for themselves.
There is nothing China has done that threatens the independence or national interest of Zimbabwe.
Sobre todo el respeto mutuo, la política
de no injerencia en los asuntos internos de Guinea Ecuatorial.
And they are doing it under our terms. They don't come and impose their terms. If they did, we'll say, don't behave like others. So we don't do that. We are talking as equals.
So with all this said, we have proven both by Marxist theory and materialistic observations that China's relationships with Africa and most of the developing world is not imperialist, but rather cooperative and welcoming. But if you're still not convinced, there's one more example I would really want you all to consider when it comes to comparing China to actual imperialism. The best example of China's foreign policy and actual imperialism could not be better exemplified than in Bolivia and what's happening there, the ousting of Evo Morales. So we all know that Bolivia's fascistic wing is currently in power after an illegal coup of Evo Morales that falsely alleged him of rigging the election. Evo Morales was a socialist, seeing here giving the Pope a hammer and sickle crucifix, as well as being a champion for Bolivia's indigenous people as well, the most vulnerable group in the country. Being Bolivia's first indigenous president and ushering waves of reforms that revolutionized the country's economy and standard of living, as all socialist countries usually do, Morales was going to use their most precious commodity to enrich the indigenous further, their lithium mines. Now, lithium is used to create batteries, specifically Tesla batteries. Bolivia has between 25% and 45% of the world's known lithium resources, an estimated 21 tons. Morales has made it clear that the lithium was not to be turned over to transnational corporations in deals favorable to the firms. What gains come from the lithium, Morales has pointed out, must properly be shared with the Bolivian people. A country that wants a share of the profit, mutual cooperation, and peaceful development. Sounds like something China would be all in for. And guess what? They were. Vijay Pashad reported that Bolivian lithium nationalization effort led Morales to seek collaboration with Chinese firms. Their deal included provisions that 50% of the profit will be shared with the Bolivian indigenous people. What's better is that Evo Morales canceled a deal with a German firm worth $250 billion as a direct result of protests from the people, saying that the deal was unfair as the profit share was highly unequal. Now, this German firm developing electric car batteries were directly linked to America's favorite capitalist, Elon Musk. And they just got their contract canceled to China. So you know what imperialists do best in this situation? A coup of a democratically elected socialist president and instill a fascistic regime to kill hundreds of indigenous Bolivians.
And Morales overturned this order to permit this $250 billion deal after weeks of protests from the actual people of Bolivia, from large segments of the indigenous community who did not want this deal to go through. But this is a deal that would have allowed the country to work with Germany to develop these lithium deposits for electric car batteries. Now, interestingly enough, ACI Systems is the company that supplies batteries to Tesla. And after this coup, after the weekend, Tesla's stock, guess what? It jumped up.
Historically. And please, any one of you out there, Google right now United Fruit Company, Google Standard Oil. The history of Latin America is fraught with those two particular companies and the U.S. going into countries in Latin America and essentially bigfooting the resources of those countries, taking all the money, all the wealth, extracting it, and leaving the people with very little. So this guy Morales comes along and says, look, I'm willing to deal with you guys, but you got to leave a little on the table for us.
And he would argue that the deal would have to benefit the Bolivian people too, and it can't just be these foreign investment firms, right? And now you even mentioned Bolivia choosing to work with China, right, in their extraction of lithium. And it's not just about Bolivia, you know, claiming its own national and natural resources. It's also about the decision to work with China, because there are a number of reasons that the U.S. government may be against this, right? Not only would this strengthen Bolivia, but it would also strengthen China, which is our main, you know, so-called rival.
And now the coup administration, led by Janine Hanez, immediately announced plans to invite transnationals, including Tesla, to exploit Bolivia's lithium reserves. A letter to Elon Musk from the foreign minister dated March 31st, said any cooperation that you or your company can provide to our country will be gratefully welcomed. And what was Elon's response to all this? Now let's compare this to what China has done. Did China invade Bolivia to protect its economic interest in the lithium? No. Did they fund any oppositional parties or infiltrate their systems to beat back their fascistic administration? Nope. Did they sponsor death squads, fund a rebel group, assassinate leaders? Absolutely not. They did none of this. Now, I think many of us would have supported China if they did accuse Bolivia's current government as illegitimate, but their economic interest would have been an overriding taint in this narrative and an affront of their foreign policy of non-intervention. They are making partnerships, not alliances, and it is incredibly upsetting that Evo Morales and the Bolivian people are continuing to be victims of United States imperialism. But I challenge everyone to accuse China of imperialism after seeing what they did in Bolivia, or lack thereof, versus Elon Musk and his OAS cronies through the United States Department. These are the imperialists we must fight, not China.